Welcome to the second installment of the series celebrating the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. My name is Nancy Wu. I'm museum educator at the Cloisters. The series of events is supported by the Plan Xacobeo and the Xunta de Galicia to celebrate the Holy Year of St. James, or Santiago. Before introducing this evening's speakers, I wish to remind everyone of the next lecture on November 12th by Professor Geraldine Dodds, and a day-long program at the Grace Rennie Rogers Auditorium upstairs on Sunday, November 14th. If you want to learn more about these two days' events, please pick up a flyer or check the museum's website. The two speakers this evening have graciously agreed to take questions, but we will hold the question session until the end of the second paper, so please remember your questions. The first speaker this evening is Professor Paula Gerson of Florida State University. She's best known for her work on Romanesque and Gothic art, having published extensively on such topics as the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, relics and reliquaries, women in the Middle Ages, and painted sculpture on medieval architecture. She's one of the most prolific authors on the Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago de Compostela. Just this year alone, she has published an article entitled Medieval Christian Pilgrims' Guides and Pilgrims' Texts in the exhibition catalog Pilgrimage and Faith, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as presenting a paper at the University of Bern, which examines architectural description in the Pilgrim's Guide. This evening, Professor Gerson will speak to us on the 12th Century Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago de Compostela, Art and Morris Along the Routes. Paula.
Thank you, Nancy, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank the Junta de Galicia and the Metropolitan. Oh, it's on this side. Oh, okay. That's hard. It's the light is here and then the mic is here. Okay. So I want to thank the Junta de Galicia and the Metropolitan Museum of Art for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to the 12th Century Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago de Compostela, one of the most intriguing texts of the early 12th century. The guide has a little bit of everything and is extraordinary for the variety of information it contains. Where to find good food, where to avoid drinking the water, where to avoid sexual deviance and thieves, important sites to visit, and the earliest description of sculpture in the West since Roman times, and a completely new way to describe architecture. As Professors Brown and Stones discussed in the last lecture in the series, the Pilgrim's Guide is one part of a larger text devoted to St. James and his cult. Now, if you happen to be a Futurama addict, let me assure you that St. James is not a robot in Leonardo's Last Supper. James the Greater was an apostle of Christ and the brother of St. John. He was beheaded by Herod Agrippa in the Holy Land, and his body was miraculously transported to the northwest coast of Spain in a rudderless boat. There are many legends of the further miraculous events that occurred after the apostle's body landed, but the body and tomb were then lost in obscurity for centuries. The saint and his tomb were rediscovered in the middle of the 9th century by a hermit named Pelayo. He notified the local bishop, Theodomir, about a strange sighting of many stars hovering over a field. The tomb was discovered, and a succession of churches were built over it. The earliest pilgrim, whose name we know, was Bishop Godescalc of Le Puy, who traveled to Santiago in the winter of 950-51. The pilgrimage grew in strength and numbers from the mid-10th century on, and perhaps spurred on by the 11th century Reconquista, it increased considerably. By the 12th century, the cult of St. James and the pilgrimage to his shrine was aggressively promoted by the very savvy bishop and then Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, Diego Gelmírez. One of the outcomes of this promotion seems to have been the production of a 5-part manuscript with addenda, which you see on the screen, the earliest extant and devoted to St. James and his cult, the entire manuscript. The earliest extant copy is in the archives of the Cathedral of Santiago, and it is variously called the Codex Calixtinus, because Pope Calixtus is the only purported author, Jacobus, after the saint, or the Liber Sancti Jacobi, that is the Book of St. James. The 5 primary texts within the manuscript are the liturgical book, the Book of the Miracles of James, the Book of the Translation of James, and that's where you get all the wonderful legends about the miraculous events once James' body reached Spain. The Pseudo-Turpin, which you may have heard about at the last lecture if you were here. And then the 5th book, The Pilgrim's Guide. There are a bunch of addenda after that. My presentation this evening concentrates on this 5th book, The Pilgrim's Guide. It's a project on which I have worked with colleagues Annie Shaver-Crandall, Alison Stones, and Jean Crochalis. The 12th Century Pilgrim's Guide is the very first guidebook to a European holy site written in the West, and it is a forerunner of the modern travel guide. Most earlier guides were written for the Holy Land, and there are a few early guides to the churches of Rome, but these are mainly just listings of churches within the city. The author of our Pilgrim's Guide gives us much more and leaves us with many unanswered questions, including his exact identity. I can say conclusively, though, that he is not Aimé Picot, a name given him in the mid-19th century, which seems to have stuck for all these years. Okay, now I have to deal with these. This is, wait a minute. We don't have technology quite like this in Tallahassee. Okay, this is the first folio of the guide from the Santiago manuscript. There are surprisingly very few copies of the guide, only 12, and they all appear in the context of the Book of St. James. The guide didn't have a separate life outside this compilation, as did, for instance, the Pseudo-Turpin, of which there are more than 200 copies. On the basis of internal dates, the guide was written by a Frenchman who visited the cathedral around 1135, but did not write his guide until after the death of Louis VI, which occurred in 1137. We know that the author was French because he refers to himself as a Frenchman many times. The author intended the guide to be used so that those who read or heard the information would know how to prepare for the expenses of the journey. And although written by a Frenchman for a French audience, there is no trace of the text in France. Almost all the copies were made in Spain and derived from the Santiago manuscript, or from a copy of it. Of the 12 extant copies, 1 is in Pistoia, 2 are in the British Library, and 2 are in the Vatican. 1 is in Lisbon, and the remaining 6 are still in Spain. The Pilgrim's Guide is the first written source that details the routes through France and Spain to Santiago. This information is found in the first 3 chapters. So, okay. 4 routes begin in France and join at here we are. And they join at Puente la Reina in Spain, if I can find it on the, here it is, here. And there is one road from Puente la Reina to Santiago at the extreme northwest corner of Spain. The southern route, beginning here in Arles, goes through well, we don't know exactly where it begins, but it goes through Arles, Saint-Gilles-du-Gard, Toulouse, Montpellier, let's see, where am I? Yes. And crosses the Pyrenees at the Somport Pass, which is right over there. The next three routes, coming from further north, join together at Astabat, which is right over around here, just north of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and they cross the Pyrenees at the Port de Cise near Roncesvalles, which is right over there. Of these, the easternmost goes, let's see, it begins here in Le Puy. It goes through Le Puy, Conques, and Moissac. Another begins up here in Vézelay and goes through Limoges and Périgueux. The westernmost route goes through Tours, here is Tours, Poitiers, comes down this way through Saintes, Sordes, and joins the other three here at the other two at Astabat. This is the route that the author of the guide knew the best, and where for the routes in France you get the most detail. However, most of the detail on the routes is given for the route in Spain. A Frenchman writing for traveling countrymen might expect them to know the major routes through France, especially since the four roads are, in fact, the old Roman roads. Here you see the pilgrimage roads in red laid over a map of the Roman roads. For Spain, the author relates that it is a 13 days journey from the crossing at Roncesvalles to Santiago, if done on horseback. The stopping and starting point of each stage is specified. And then, to be absolutely clear, the author lists all the major towns the pilgrim will pass. Let me go backwards here. Will pass through, and giving a couple of highlights, mainly which towns have good wine and bread, a topic that comes up again and again in other parts of the guide. The landscape through which the pilgrim travels, both in France and Spain, is magnificent, although the author mentions only one such natural site. He also does not discuss much of the art and architecture along the routes, with one exception, until he arrives at the Cathedral of Santiago. But the modern traveler along the routes is overwhelmed by the beauty encountered. Before returning to the text of the guide itself, I have a little slideshow I want to show you of some of the things you see along the route in order to perhaps entice you to make your own pilgrimage. And I think Professor Simon's paper will also act in the same way. The 5 routes, the 4 in France, 1 in Spain, encompass many of the most spectacular edifices from the late 11th and from the 12th centuries, as well as those from later centuries. This is not entirely surprising, since the roads through France were those ancient Roman roads, and that is where many monastic establishments set down roots. As the old saying goes, location, location, location. Along the southern route in France, here is the cloister at Arles, the facade at Saint-Gilles. So we're just moving this way, right? Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, and one of my favorites, a small church of Sept-Aigons in the foothills of the Pyrenees. This route crossed the Pyrenees at Somport Pass, which you see here. Now, at the start, let me go up to this is the Le Puy route. And this is the small church of Saint-Michel-d'Aiguille in Le Puy. So the route started in Le Puy. This is a volcanic, what is it called? A kind of cord. They're fairly common in the area, but this is particularly spectacular. So from there, so we're tracing this route this way to Conques. This is the interior. Here's the exterior and the wonderful tympanum with which still bears a lot of its original paint. As we continue southwest, you pass through Cahors. Let me see, get to Cahors. There's the old bridge at Cahors and the portal at the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne. And then you continue on and you get to the south flank entrance portal at Moissac. The route from Le Puy ends here at Ostabat, just north of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and it's here that these three routes, the Le Puy, Vézelay, and Tours, meet before the Pyrenees. This is a modern marker which celebrates the site. Now the third route begins here at Vézelay, and this is the view of the hilltop abbey from across the valley. Let's see, we have this is the Abbey Church's horribly restored facade and a procession in the interior. Continuing south, the lovely little church of Saint-Solange, not very well known. It's north of Bourges. And south of Bourges, at Issoudun, the Pilgrim's Bridge, and this is the remains of an old hospice, which I think is now an art gallery. The route again continues further down and meets at Ostabat. The last of the four routes through France probably began around Paris, up here, and went through Orleans, here. But the author of the guide speaks of it as the Tours route. Here's Tours. One of the major cities on this route is Poitiers, and this is the very old baptistry of Saint-Jean in the town. It dates back to the 4th century, but was then redone in the 11th, and then, of course, as you can see, afterwards. Also, two other monuments in Poitiers are Notre-Dame-la-Grande on the left and a nice etching of Saint-Hilaire on the right. So after these three routes then, coming from Le Puy, Vézelay, and Tours, meet at Ostabat, and then continue through Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which is right at it's over here, at the foothills, before you really begin to climb. And they cross the Pyrenees here at Port de Cise, which is near Roncesvalles. And this is the marker at the top of the pass. It is here that the author speaks in wonder at the beauties of the natural world, and this is something quite rare for him. The height of the mountain is so great that it seems to reach the sky. To him who ascends it, it seems that he can touch the sky with his own hand. He claims that one can see the Atlantic Ocean, the Sea of Brittany, as well as Castile, Aragon, and France from this spot, but I'm not sure about the veracity. For me, the route through Spain is the most glorious. Descending from the Samport Pass here, the first town is Jaca. This is the this is the south portal of the cathedral. Nearby, the amazing Monastery of San Juan de la Peña, which is built right into the mountainside. From the pass, then if you go through the pass at Port de Cis, you go through Pamplona. So we just saw this bit, and if you go through Port de Cis, Roncesvalles, you come down into Pamplona, which is here, and end up at Puente la Reina here, where the four routes coming through France meet, and then, of course, it's just one straight route across Spain. And this is the bridge at Puente la Reina. You then go through absolutely fabulous countryside in Rioja, and I think I have one more wonderful scenic pic here. Yeah. And these last three show you the original roads which you can still travel on today. So you come next to Estella. This is the Church of San Pedro de la Rua, which is right alongside the Pilgrim's Road in Estella. And continuing westward, Ionate, whose architecture is meant to recall the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So we're moving this way. Coming up to Burgos, this is the great Gothic cathedral in Burgos, which has replaced what the author of the guide would have seen in the 12th century, an earlier church. These are poppy fields along the old road, again on the old road between Burgos and Fromista, whose church is dedicated to Saint Martin. A festival in Carrion de los Condes, it's over here. And these are these wonderful gigantes. I haven't seen them in France, but they have them at many of the feasts in Spain. And also in Carrion, the church of, this is the church of Santa Maria del Camino, Saint Mary of the Road. We continue through Saragon. This is San Tirso, to Leon, San Isidoro, and this is the tympanum of the Lamb. It's this tympanum right over in there, and then to this the church of Saint James in Villafranca del Bierzo. Perhaps the most mystical and amazing sight of all is at the top of the last mountain before you reach Galicia. This is the site of Cebrero, El Cebrero. There are truly some places in the world which one feels so intensely they send shivers up and down your spine. And El Cebrero is absolutely one. This is an image here in the morning mist, and as the mist clears, you can see these structures. They're called paeses, and the design goes back to the Celtic settlement on this mountaintop. Finally, you arrive with other pilgrims in front of the Apostles' Church in Compostela. I have barely scratched the wonders of these routes, now conveniently marked by the Council of Europe, and so easy to follow. I hope this brief digression, and what you will see in the next lecture, inspires you to seek out these routes. Back to the text. After enumerating the routes, the length of the journeys, and the towns in Spain, there are two very brief chapters mentioning hospices and the names of persons who repaired the road leading to Santiago. The two chapters which followed are much more substantial and discuss dangers along the roads from water and from people. There is nothing like this in earlier guides for travelers, and the text gives us a very interesting view of life in the 1130s. First, the rivers. Let me see, I think I have. Here, okay. So he next talks about all the rivers in Spain. This is, we'll come to this one in a minute. This is in Estella, the river Ega, which is okay. The rivers between the Pyrenees and Puente la Reina seem to have caused no problems. But just past Puente la Reina, where these roads meet, at Lorca, there is a river called the Salty Brook, about which fair warning is given. On the banks of this deadly river, the author encountered two men of Navarre, quote, sitting, sharpening their knives. They are in the habit of skinning the mounts of pilgrims who drink that water and die. The members of the author's traveling group had asked if the water was safe to drink, and the Navarrese said yes. They watered their horses, and two immediately died and were skinned on the spot. Just beyond Lorca, at the river Ega in Estella, that's this image, the water is fine. But all the rivers, he says, between Estella and Logroño, so from here to, can't quite see Logroño on the map here, but over around here, have water that is poisonous to men and beasts, and even the fish from them are poisonous. In fact, pilgrims are informed that all the fish in Spain should not be eaten because, quote again, should you eat any of them, red mullet, the aloes, or eels, in any part of Spain or Galicia, you will undoubtedly die shortly afterwards, or at least fall ill. And if by chance someone ate some and did not get sick, it is because he was healthier than others, or because he has remained for a long time in that country. All the fish and pork of the whole of Spain and Galicia cause illness to foreigners. However, he ends this chapter saying that most of the rivers between Burgos and Santiago are okay. The chapter on rivers is followed by one on the inhabitants and the lands that the pilgrims passes through. All the areas mentioned in this chapter are on the Tour Road and the Pyrenees crossing and go through the Pyrenees crossing at Roncesvalles. The only people lauded by the author are the Poitevins, which has led many to think that the author is himself Poitevin. He says they are valiant heroes, daring in battle, elegant in dress, good-looking, generous in gift-giving, and hospitality. But as one moves south, it is downhill. The people of the Saintonge and the Bordelais, so further down this way, have rustic speech, and the people of Gascony are verbose, libidinous, drunkards, and prodigious eaters. And it continues to get worse as the author approaches the foothills of the Pyrenees. At Sourde-l'Abeille, which you see here, and it's just around there, there are two rivers that come together and must be crossed by boat. Here, the pilgrim is warned not to get into a very full boat, especially not one with horses. The ferrymen overfill the boat so that they capsize. The pilgrims drown, and the ferrymen rejoice wickedly after seizing the spoils from the dead. And then close to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, there are unscrupulous toll-takers who search pilgrims down to their underwear for money. I have no images of what follows, and you will soon understand why. The author's most racist invectives are directed at the Basques and Navarrese as he crosses the Pyrenees and descends the mountains into Spanish lands. The author describes the clothing worn by Basques and Navarrese, calling it repulsive. Even though he calls their language barbarous, he gives us the very first written list of Basque words, very valuable today for students of languages. He considers their customs utterly barbarous. In dining, the whole household, master and mistress and servant, all eat together from one pot, using their hands and not spoons. If you saw them eat, you would think them dogs or pigs. And I have some lengthy quotes here. This is a barbarous race, unlike all other races in custom and character, full of malice, swarthy in color, evil of face, depraved, perverse, perfidious, empty of faith and corrupt, libidinous, drunken, experienced in all violence, ferocious and wild, dishonest and reprobate, impious and harsh, cruel and contentious, unversed in anything good, well-trained in all vices and iniquities, in everything inimical to our French people. For a mere numus, a Navarrese will kill, if he can, a Frenchman. The author then launches into the sexual deviance of the Basques and Navarrese. In certain regions of the country, that is in Biscay and Alava, when the Navarrese are warming themselves, a man will show a woman and a woman a man their private parts. The Navarrese even practice unchaste fornication with animals, for the Navarrese is said to hang a padlock behind his mule and his mare, so that none can come near her but himself. He even offers libidinous kisses to the vulva of woman and mule. That is why the Navarrese are to be rebuked by all experienced people. At the end of this diatribe, he does give the Basques and Navarrese credit for being good fighters and for leaving offerings at altars. The author has very little to say about the peoples encountered after this, after he leaves the Basque and Navarrese regions, until he gets to Galicia, which he extols for its water, food, cider, and ocean fish. He concludes, "The Galicians, in truth, more than any other uncultivated Spanish peoples, are those who most closely resemble our French race by their manners, but they are alleged to be irascible and very litigious." The next chapter in the guide is somewhat problematic, but in a different way. The chapter addresses many religious establishments with important saints' relics that the pilgrim should visit on his way to Santiago. It is problematic because the voice of the primary author does not come clearly through in the text. In assessing authorship of a text, one looks for consistency of style, word use, frequency of words, sentence structure, and grammatical use. The Latin usage in this chapter differs from that found in the rest of the guide. Thus the question, do we have a different author here? In the end, I think not. What we do have is an author who has access to a very good library as he is writing this chapter. If nothing else, it also marks the compiler of this chapter as a cleric. Most of the rest of the guide is based on first-hand observation or repetition of stories heard directly by the author, and his voice is clearly heard. But here the author seems to be borrowing from earlier martyrologies and saints' lives, and quite a bit from the styles in which they are written. For each saint's shrine to be visited, we are given episodes from the life of the saint, a few miracles, the martyrdom, if it's pertinent, and the feast day of the saint. The description in the guide is arranged so that if the saints' shrines follow exactly the same routes as laid out at the very beginning of the text. And the greatest emphasis on shrines is found for those on that westernmost route from Tours. Going through the previous 8 chapters of the guide, a picture of the author begins to emerge. Clearly French, he may have been a Poitevin, since these are the only people about whom he has only good things to say, and he does know best this westernmost route through France. He was a cleric and highly placed enough or rich enough to be able to travel by horse. He seems to be well educated, but his Latin is not of the highest quality. At some point in his career, he spent time or passed through southern France, perhaps on the way to Rome, because he knows the monuments at Arles and at Saint-Gilles. He's very interested in all sorts of things, clothing, strange customs, language of other cultures, and he had fairly good research abilities, as can be seen in his chapter on the saints' shrines and relics to be visited. However, none of this prepares us for the author's description of the Church of Santiago de Compostela. It is all-encompassing as no other text since the late antique period. His clear method of organization stands out, and he is the first author to use subheadings in writing about a church monument. The text begins with the geographic site of the town and its 7 gates. This is followed by a list of the 10 other churches in the town, and then a full description of the cathedral, its architecture, sculpture, altars, furnishings, the altar of St. James, dates of construction, and names of the master masons. To fully understand how innovative this description is, it's important to know that descriptions of churches are very rare in general for the early Middle Ages. Eusebius's description of the Holy Sepulchre site really stands alone, and he describes the structures on the site as if he is walking through the various buildings. He begins at the cave tomb and then moves toward the eastern entrances. But for the late antique period and the early medieval period, almost all other writing about buildings is concerned not with the fabric of the building, but with the gifts of gold and silver given to it. The other element which is frequently described are the paintings on the walls and the inscriptions on the walls. The major exception is in the text of Gregory of Tours, who in the 6th century seems to be the first to introduce dimensions, and as well as the number of windows, doors, and columns in describing the 5th century church of Saint Martin at Tours. And he uses as a model the description of Solomon's temple. And I have really been very surprised to find that so few other medieval authors go back to that description. There are 2 important descriptions from the 11th century that predate the description in the guide. Get back to the slides here. Oops. Yes, this is Saint-Benin in Dijon, and the author who is writing this description, this is from the 11th century, and the author gives the length of the building using cubits, what the measurement used by for the description of Solomon's temple, And he takes you on a tour of the building. He begins in the lower part of the church, below here, where where the relics of San Benigno are kept. He then continues to the lowest level of the rotunda, and you go all the way up here, up to the top level of the rotunda, and then you descend back down to the ground floor, and through various passageways, you get out to the western entrance. You then re-enter the basilica here at the main portal and are given lots of measurements. And then you go back down to the crypt, to the shrine of San Benigno itself. The other model which is used, this is the Abbey Church of Monte Cassino, and the description here is from the second half of the 11th century, and it was written by Leo of Ostia about Desiderius's building. This is much longer and more comprehensive than any description up until the 11th century. But when you closely analyze it, you see that Leo is absolutely following the order of the description of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 6 and 7. So I'm not going to go through that in great detail, but I want to point it out. He begins here in the sanctuary. He's coming down this side here, mentions these buildings, then comes down to the atrium. He even uses an interesting detail here. In the description of Solomon's temple, at one point, Solomon sends to Tyre for someone who could work in bronze and create beautiful bronze objects. And at the same point in the text of the description, Leo tells us that Desiderius sends to Constantinople to bring in craftsmen to work on the church. So, but this is really what you have prior to the text in the guide. If we turn to I think I may be running a little late here, but this is a model of what we think the church looked like in the early 12th century. You're going to see, if you come to the Sunday presentation, you'll see a very nice video. Is it video or model? Yeah, digital imaging of the church. So now this description is very different. The author is concerned with the fabric and structure of the building as no other earlier medieval writer I have been able to find. And the author is writing to communicate knowledge, not simply to record. He's clear, he presents the building in a logical order, but not as if on tour. He first describes the fabric of the building, the interior architecture, then the exterior sculpture and towers. After this, he does go back inside to the altars and the works related to the altar of St. James, finishing up with a note on who can celebrate Mass at the altar and the names of the master masons, Bernard, the Elder, and Robert, who worked on the building. An organization so clearly laid out is unprecedented in medieval writing about architecture and church building. Most important, and this may not seem so at first, but he does use subheadings. In all previous texts, the descriptions are continuous and not separated clearly into units of information. Leo's text is divided into chapters, but they have no subheadings, and they are time-based, not monument-based. By this I mean Leo begins in chapter 26. He describes the process of preparation of the site, acquiring materials, and he continues through the process of construction and decoration, ending in chapter 29 with the dedication of the church. So it's a very different way of dealing with this. The description of the architecture in the guide does begin with dimensions for which there are precedents in the description of Solomon's temple, passed down perhaps through Gregory of Tours. But the author does not use biblical cubits. He doesn't use feet. The author's unit of measurement is the stature of a man, which he defines as 8 palms. He is not using Vitruvius directly, as Vitruvius figures 10 palms to the height of the man, not 8, but he is using a Vitruvian system. Very unusual. There are still unanswered questions about how he has arrived at this pseudo-Vitruvian unit of measurement, but this is indeed what he uses for the length, height, width of the building. And this is the first inkling we have that our author is consulting the masons or another knowledgeable person. The description of the spaces in the church is also more complete than any previous one. A main nave and transepts, each with side aisles and galleries above. The author then launches into, and this is very interesting, here, into a description of the ground plan that compares the layout of the building to a body. He begins at the top with the axial chapel, which has a laurel wreath. Below, that's the ambulatory. Then one body and 2 limbs for the main nave and transept arms. And while there are literary and theological references to the church as the body of Christ, I know of no earlier architectural description to use this allegory to describe an actual church plan. After this overall view, the author then goes on to describe in greater detail different aspects of the building, where everything is placed, and he uses a term, medii cindriae, a technical term, which he says he's gotten from the stonemasons. The section on the nave, aisles, and upper galleries concludes then with the width of the naves and transepts. He then goes on to describe in great detail the galleries. There are as many arches. Please go forward here. As many arches below here as there are above. And he concludes this subsection with a kind of old and traditional topos about the happiness achieved by visiting the galleries and seeing perfect beauty. For the description of the sculpture, there were no models or earlier examples to which the author might have referred as he sets about describing the sculpture on the north, south, and west entrances. These 3 portals contain the earliest complex portal sculpture we know of in the West, and they are dated at the very end of the 11th century or by some very early in the 12th century. The sculpture on the north transept portal, which is called the Portal of the French here, was completely removed in the 18th century, and some of the pieces were moved over here to the south transept portal, and some of them are now in the Cathedral Museum. So it's difficult to compare the author's description to the objects described. The same is true of the sculpture on the west facade, in part because there it is pretty rudimentary, so it's possible the author was looking at the sculpture before it was completely installed. And you may be hearing more about this in further talks. It's much easier to understand the south transept portal, which is called the Plateaus portal, because the sculpture here is mostly in place. You simply have to ignore for the moment those works brought over from the north portal that do not belong in the original configuration. The author begins at tympana level, here and here, addressing the tympanum on the right with the, here, the tympanum on the right with the betrayal, so we're over here. Does that show? Yeah, with the betrayal of Christ. There the Lord is bound to a pillar by the hands of the Jews. There he is beaten with scourges. There sits Pilate on his throne as if judging him. Higher, in another row, here, is Mary, the mother of the Lord, with her son at Bethlehem, and the three kings who came to visit the boy with his mother. There are apostles on this door, here and here, as if guarding the portal, and there are two guarding the portal on the left. The left portal depicts the temptation of Christ. There are, in fact, in front of the Lord, hideous angels like specters who place him on the pinnacle of the temple. And others offer him stones, urging him to make bread of them, and others display before him the kingdoms of the world, pretending that they will give them to him if he would fall down and worship them, which does not come to pass. But other radiant angels, that is, good ones, behind his back, and others also above with censers, minister to him. At this level, there are 4 lions. You can just barely make out the lions here. And then at the lower level, the columns, some of which are marble. Then in something of an afterthought, the author mentions this figure here in the temptation. No, wait a minute. I've lost something. Oh dear, I've lost an image. Okay. It's this figure here, the woman holding a skull on her lap. There's been considerable scholarly debate about this figure, who may actually be Hades, but the author of the guide describes her as an adulterous woman holding between her own hands the stinking head of her lover, cut off by her rightful husband, which she is forced to kiss twice a day. Oh, what ingenious and admirable justice for an adulterous wife. It should be recounted to everyone. Very hard to determine from where he got this information. So after he describes the lower levels of the doorways, he goes on to the upper level. The original figures up here, Christ with Peter on his left and James on his right. The only figure still there, original figure, is this one of St. James between the cypress trees. The guide concludes with a discussion of how pilgrims ought to be treated as they travel the roads to Santiago. There are cautionary tales of what happens to those who do not offer hospitality to pilgrims. Can we now enlarge our characterization of this French author, who was perhaps, oh, there's the lady with the skull on her lap. Sorry, it's in the wrong place. Okay. Can we now enlarge our characterization of this French author, who was perhaps Poitevin and a well-placed cleric? His interests were certainly wide-ranging: where to find good food and water, the customs of the lands visited, dangers along the roads traveled. He is also a collector of knowledge, an organizer, and a synthesizer. In writing Chapter 8 of the Guide on the relics to be visited, he used a very good library from which to assemble a coherent body of information. He organized the saints' lives he wished to include in his discussion of the routes, so he seems to like research. But when he decides to describe the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, a good library is not much help. So he does the next best thing. He asks the experts. And then he organizes this information into coherent format. He's a creative thinker, innovative and brilliant in presenting information in a comprehensible form. His description of the architecture of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela goes far beyond any previous medieval descriptions. He is, in fact, the very first in a line of future authors like Suger Saint-Denis or Gervase of Canterbury in finding ways to describe art and architecture in the later Middle Ages. Thank you.